Good evening, and welcome everybody. I'm Jack Fairweather, President and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And thanks to all the members of my family who have been able to join us here. Museum of Jewish Heritage is a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of Jack Fairweather's new book, The Volunteer, which tells the little-known story of Witold Pilecki. Witold Pilecki, a Polish army officer and resistance leader who spent nearly 3 years in Auschwitz secretly working to undermine the Germans and inform the Allies of the Nazi crimes. Jack is joined in conversation tonight by the co-host of NPR's On Point, David Folkenflik. We are honored to have them with us tonight. For supporting tonight's special program, I'd especially like to thank our wonderful Patty Asquith-Kenner, member of the Board of Trustees, and our guests here this evening in support of the Auschwitz Jewish Center and the AJCF, the Auschwitz Jewish Center Foundation, a member of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust family. I'd also like to thank and warmly welcome everyone joining us tonight's live stream on mjhnyc.org/live. It's my pleasure now to introduce Polish Consul General Maciej Golubowski. Maciej is originally from Lodz, Poland, a very experienced diplomat. Maciej Golubowski has been associated with the Sobieski Institute in Warsaw as an expert on the EU and foreign policy for almost 10 years. It's my honor to invite him to introduce our speakers, author Jack Fairweather and NPR's David Folkenflik. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'll skip the funny anecdotes, not because the real treat is ahead of you. I heard Jack last night at the consulate, and I don't want to speak too long, but it befits me to say a few words of introduction, because both the book that I've read and Pilecki himself are very close to my heart. So ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage and its director, Jack Fairweather, for agreeing to host this event and inviting me here. It is a real distinction, bearing in mind the significance of the museum for preserving the memory of the Jewish Holocaust, singularly and exceptionally tragic event for the Jewish people, so that we never forget. I'm all the more personally moved that I can be here today to celebrate the story of an extraordinary man, the son of Poland, Captain Witold Pilecki, as told by an equally extraordinarily gifted writer and historian, Jack Fairweather, with whom, incidentally, we went to high school, boarding school, so that's the serendipity there. Looking at Jack's life story, you'd understand why he might have been drawn to Captain Pilecki's story. After graduating from Oxford, he became a Middle East bureau chief correspondent for the Washington Post and the Daily Telegraph. As an embedded reporter, Jack put himself in jeopardy during the invasion in Iraq and other places in the Middle East to witness the truth of what actually went on there. This led him to win a prestigious British Press Award for one of his already 3 books. With that one will be 3. Jack, is that true? 3. Congratulations. But why is the story of Pilecki and Jack's telling of his story so extraordinarily important for all of us? I think there are 3 reasons. First and foremost is because Pilecki was one of the first ones to realize and witness firsthand the genocidal potential of Auschwitz, what it specifically meant for the fate of the Jews, and called on the world to bomb it, just as it was about to start its pernicious genocidal mission. If the world had listened, 1 million lives would have been saved. Second, he did not act as a lone wolf. He was an officer, first of the Polish army, and then serving in the official underground home army that operated on the orders of the Polish government in exile in London. His smuggled reports were the voice of Poland during the Second World War, ignored by the Western Allies, often because of anti-Semitic prejudice, as you will learn by reading Jack's book. And finally, it shows how little the Western world still knows of the contribution of Poland to the Allied war effort, also through intelligence gathering on the wartime plight of the Jews. Jan Karski, whom some of you, I'm sure, know, carried elements of Pilecki's report to President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. Read Jack's book to realize how far behind Poland they were in mustering courage to stop the Holocaust. Pilecki's fate encapsulates the enormity of two totalitarianisms, not just the Nazi socialist one. Shot in the back of the head by the Polish communists in 1948, he was also witness to the evil of the Soviet-imposed communism in Poland. He was part of the group of soldiers who opposed the new communist occupation, called the cursed soldiers, due to the hopelessness of their fight. He exemplified what is often mocked today, sometimes, by, in this world, faith, family, tradition. His words sent to his children in one of his last letters from the communist prisons were, and I quote, "Love your homeland, love your parents, persist in your faith, be good people." But how can we talk about Pilecki to those whose frame of reference is a secularized and often disenchanted world where the talk of heroism smells of fairy tales? I believe that this is now the enormous contribution of Jack, who brings the understanding of Witold to the whole world. Jack uniquely manages to translate Witold's cultural rootedness, universalizes it, and makes it understandable to everybody of all races and creeds. Jack Fairweather's book, how I read it, makes us understand the power of hindsight. Heroes are not seers. Pilecki first and foremost was a virtuous man who served humanity through his absolute commitment to Poland. Jack writes, and I quote, "Patriotism of this strength can seem outdated or wearisomely like the preserve of the far right rising on a tide of nationalism. But we must also reckon with the fact that Witold's patriotism furnished him with a sense of service and a moral compass that sustained his sense of purpose of the camp," unquote. His example let other prisoners survive. As Jack says, and I quote again, "So long as the prisoners could believe in the greater good, they were not defeated," unquote. There are profound lessons, I believe, for all of us, for all in today's, and I use that word again, disenchanted world, for those who are bullied for their beliefs or for being different, for those who want to do good, but can't find more guidance than oft-repeated mantras about self-improvement that often dismiss the perspective of being another one's brother's keeper. Or finally, for leaders in business and education who are looking for ways to build trust and teamwork. Pilecki is really a hero for all times and all people, and we owe Jack that soon the world will realize why. Today, Jack will be joined in the conversation, as Director Klicker said, by David Folkenflik, an American reporter based in New York City and serving as media correspondent for National Public Radio. Please welcome Jack and David.
Thank you, Matsia. Thank you, Jack, for having me. It's really such an honor to speak at the museum tonight, and especially with that extraordinary exhibition of Auschwitz that I hope most of you have seen. Is the clicker here for the presentation?
We can't see the slides because the chairs are blocking the slides. If you're going to do a slide presentation.
I am.
Thank you very much. If you move them, that'd be great. Thank you.
So, I'd like you all to picture a scene with me. It's 6 a.m., September the 19th, 1940, and a Polish underground operative named Witold Pilecki sits in an apartment in the Zoliborz district of Warsaw. Oh. Can we change the slide? Brilliant. This is the apartment in 1940. Next slide, please. And there is Pilecki in his favorite tweed jacket. He's 38 years old, a reserve officer in the Polish cavalry, a farmer, a devout Catholic, and a father of two. Next image. Here are his two kids, Andrei and Zofia in fancy dress. Next image. And here is his wife, Maria. Before the war, Poland was one of the more pluralistic societies in Europe. A tenth of the population is Jewish, the largest such community in Europe. Then the Germans invaded. Next image, please. Click it twice. And again. Here we see German troops parading through Warsaw in October 1939 under the watchful eye of Adolf Hitler. Hitler hadn't formulated his plans to annihilate the Jews at this stage. He was intent on the destruction of Poland by eliminating its professional classes, doctors, teachers, lawyers. Next image, please, double click. Poland is subject to a brutal reign of terror, where thousands of Poles, Jews and Catholics alike, are being dragged off the streets to be shot or interned. In June 1940, the Germans opened the Auschwitz concentration camp to hold these so-called political prisoners. Next image, please. Here we see a map of pre-war Poland. In the top right, the arrow points to Pilecki's hometown of Krupa. In the bottom left, it points to a town called Auschwitz, the Germans known as Auschwitz, called Auschwitz. So Pilecki's learned from informants that a roundup is scheduled for Zoliborz that morning and that those arrested will be sent to Auschwitz. That's why he's waiting in the apartment. His mission is to infiltrate the camp, forge a resistance cell, and gather evidence of Nazi crimes. So let's go back to the apartment. Next image, please. So just picture with me for a moment. The truck's rumbling to a stop outside. Shouts and gunshots follow. The building caretaker bangs on the door. It's a German roundup, he cries. Get out while you still can. What does Pilecki do? He picks up a teddy bear lying on the floor, hands it to his 3-year-old nephew, who's sitting up wide-eyed in bed, and then calmly puts on his jacket as the door bursts open and, against every instinct he must have had, steps into captivity. 2 days later, he arrived in Auschwitz. Next image, please. Here we see the camp, a picture taken in 1945 by Soviet troops. Arbeit macht frei, above the gate, work sets you free, that terrible motto. Next image. And here is Pilecki now, as a prisoner. Over the next 2.5 years, Pilecki forged an underground army in Auschwitz that sabotaged facilities, assassinated SS officers, and plotted an armed uprising. He arrived in Auschwitz at its beginning as a concentration camp for Poles, and thus he witnessed the steps by which the Nazis conceived of and built their death factory for Europe's Jews. He was the first to alert the world of the camp's horrors and the first to try and stop them. 3 years before Allied commanders publicly acknowledged the camp's existence, Pilecki was urging them to bomb it. And yet, for all of his exploits in Auschwitz, his story is almost unknown. Indeed, I only heard about it by chance. In 2011, I met up with a reporter friend of mine, Matt McAllister. We covered the wars in the Middle East together, trying to make sense of what had happened. Next image. This was a suicide car bomb that I was caught in Mosul in 2005. That tank to the right was my tank, and by great good fortune, the blast doors had closed just enough to redirect the force of the explosion away, only injuring a few. Next image. And then we were then caught in an ambush. That's me in my press jacket to the left. There were bullets flying by, and the fighting only ended when a US jet dropped a 500-pound bomb a few hundred feet away. Matt had traveled to Auschwitz and learned about a resistance cell in the camp. The idea that anyone could resist the Nazis in such a place was a shock to me. I thought of the camp as an ultimate symbol of suffering and victimhood. If resistance was possible there, I thought, what wasn't possible? Pilecki seemed to offer this startling new way to look at the camp, not through the eyes of a victim, but through the eyes of a protagonist. I also felt personally challenged by the story, because Pilecki was the same age as me when he volunteered for Auschwitz. We both had 2 kids at the time and a house and a home. What would make him risk everything for such a mission? And what was it about this act of volunteering that spoke so powerfully to me? I knew I had to find out. Then I discovered the other extraordinary thing about Pilecki's story. Almost nothing was written about it. I managed to glean a little bit online, Pilecki had gone on to fight the communists at the end of World War II, had been captured and executed, and then all trace of his wartime records destroyed or locked away. It wasn't until 2012 that one of Pilecki's reports that had been smuggled out of the country in the 40s was finally translated into English. Next image, please. Here is that report. You can see Pilecki's looping blue handwriting around the edge. Next image. And this is the filing cabinet where that report sat for decades, largely unread. This report that I read only seemed to deepen the mystery for me because it was filled with gaps. Names were hidden to protect colleagues, events obscured or omitted, and the report also left unanswered some crucial questions like, what happened to the intelligence he risked his life in the camp to smuggle out? Why were his calls for action unheeded? And of course, the biggest one of all, how many lives might have been saved? Almost 3 years ago, I set out to try and find the answer to these questions. Now, I flew to Warsaw in January 2016. The first person I wanted to see was Witold's son, Andrzej. I was a bit nervous, to put it mildly, ahead of meeting him. After all, who was I to suddenly alight upon his father's story? Andrzej was little more than a child when Pilecki was executed. Next image. Here he is with his sister. For 50 years, Andrzej had been told that his father was an enemy of the state, and he only discovered about Pilecki's mission to Auschwitz in the 1990s, when the communist archives were open. Of course, I shouldn't have worried about meeting Andrzej. Next image, please. He was the most delightful, engaged, and sweet man I could have possibly alighted upon, and I spent many hours in his living room there. That first meeting, he warned me, I'm not sure what else you'll find, or where you should start looking. Well, I looked him straight in the eyes and said, with you, Andrzej. When so little is known about a man, I knew that every detail that Andrzej could give me was important. I couldn't recreate Pilecki's thoughts beyond what he had written and what people like Andrzej, who had known him, could tell me. What I found amazing as I began to research that story was just how many people were still alive who had known Witold. Many had never shared their memories before, either because they dared not to, or simply because no one had asked them. Next image. Here's Bohdan Walasek, 92 years old. Next image. And Jerzy Zalewski, 94. Both of these men fought along Pilecki in the Warsaw Uprising. We've never spoken about their experience with Pilecki. In addition to gathering living testimony, I also wanted to follow in Pilecki's footsteps as much as possible. Much was destroyed in the uprising, but some of the key sites still existed, none more important for me than the apartment where Pilecki was arrested. It was the first place I visited after seeing Andrzej. Next image. Here is that apartment in 2016. Next image, double click, it's a video. And this is entering the stairs. So with my researcher, Marta, we want to recreate that moment when the Germans barged into the room, which was just as well that we did because, next image, here is the door. We knocked on that door like proper Gestapo men next door, and finally managed to rouse the sleepy student inside. And next image, here is the room where Pilecki volunteered, now student apartment. To write about that scene, I felt I needed to see it with my own eyes, but even better was when I could bring someone who had memories of that scene along. So do you remember that 3-year-old boy I told you about with the teddy bear? Next image. Here he is, sitting on Pilecki's lap shortly before his arrest. Turned out that that boy, next image, is still alive, now in his 80s. This is him 83 years later, standing on the banks of the Vistula. So I brought him to the apartment. It was the first time he'd been back in almost 80 years. The communists had taken the apartment over after the war. Next image. Here he is confirming to me that that door we banged on was indeed the door that the Germans had seized Pilecki through. Next image. And here he is showing us the layout of the room. Marek remembered that dawn morning. It was his memory of the teddy bear that returning to the apartment made him recall. and that for me spoke so eloquently of Pilecki's ability in moments of stress to look beyond himself. He even remembered the exact moment that Pilecki was arrested. Next image. Double click. So here he is talking me through the moment that the Germans entered the room. I came to know Marek quite well over the course of interviews, and he recounts here how, as Pilecki walked past him into captivity, he whispered to him, "See you later." And you'll see at just the end of this clip how Marek, as he recounts that memory, his eyes tear up just there. And by the end of that visit, he was in tears, recalling what Pilecki meant to him and his family. To write this book in the vivid and compelling way I wanted to, I knew I was going to need hundreds, if not thousands, of details like this. And the first time I realized this book might be possible was upon visiting the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, where there are over 3,500 prisoner testimonies, hundreds of which touched on Pilecki's work or described events that he witnessed. So let's go back to that moment Pilecki arrives in the camp. Next image. It's the evening of September the 21st, 1941. A light rain is falling. The train screeches to the halt. Pilecki's in a cattle cart with 60 other men. They hear the sound of the doors being slammed open, and then shouts, German orders. The door to Pilecki's cart opens, and he's dragged from it, beaten, forced into the camp. There he's stripped, shaved, and issued prisoner clothes and a camp number to replace his name. Of course, there are no photographs taken of that moment, but several prisoners who arrived around the same time as Pilecki survived and made pictures after the war. Next image. Here we see what that scene looked like. The next image. This is a very rare early photograph of the camp. In the background, that white building was Pilecki's barrack block on the second floor, and to the left was where the roll call was held 3 times a day for the prisoners, morning, midday, and evening. Next image. And here is a representation of one of those roll calls. The evening one was in some ways the harshest, because that was the moment when the bodies of those who had been beaten to death were gathered. Next image. And they were then dragged to the crematorium beside the main gate. Next image. And this is the first oven in Auschwitz. Bodies were used on that metal truck, pushed two in a time into the flames. So Pilecki describes in his 45 report this scene vividly, but I wanted more, because the more details I could use, the closer I could come to understanding Pilecki's responses. And that's what I wanted after all, to understand that moment when he began to resist, to understand how it was possible. So my researchers, Marta and Kasia, found dozens of testimonies describing his first few days. None for me was more important than the extraordinary moment a few weeks into his time in the camp when he began recruiting prisoners. And we found a testimony that with remembered dialogue of that moment. It's one of my favorite scenes in the book. Pilecki approaches a 21-year-old prisoner called Konstanty Piekarski. Next image. Here is Piekarski. The prisoners could gather after evening roll call for about an hour before curfew. They were all on starvation rations of 1,000 calories a day, covered in welts from bruises and beatings, exhausted from days of hard labor. Next image. This is the area that they typically gathered in. Next image. And here's the representation of that marketplace. It captured some of the fear and the tension, the prisoners bartering food, that one man looking over his shoulder nervously, a German capo, one of the functionaries that ran the camp, beating a prisoner in the background. Pilecki takes Piekarski to one side and reveals to him the existence of the underground. Piekarski's response makes me smile because of its honesty. "Are you nuts?" he says. "Look at us. We're not in a position to fight back against the Nazis." So I like this scene because Pilecki, by putting his trust in Piekarski, was able to show him how something greater than themselves was able to endure in the camp. And that sense of something greater than themselves was what helped prisoners like Piekarski survive. The early camp resistance was dedicated to helping prisoners get enough food. But at some point, Pilecki realized that that wasn't enough in itself. He wanted to start fighting back. He initially wanted to stage an uprising, but he realized that would be suicide given the conditions of the prisoners, and that he would need help from the outside. So to get the Allies to intervene, he created an intelligence gathering operation. Of course, that led him to his first major challenge. How in the world do you get a message out of Auschwitz? Escaping was out of the question. Too dangerous, and any attempt led to harsh reprisals on other prisoners. But occasionally, a few were released if their families had paid the right bribes in Warsaw. So Pilecki mentions the name of his first messenger from the camp, Alexander Wielopolski. No one had tried to track down what happened to this report. But with that one name, my researcher Louisa found his son, an elegant gentleman in his 80s named Piotr. Next image. Here he is when we met. So Piotr had no idea that his father was the first messenger from the camp, bearing news of its horrors. He shared a couple of images of his father. Here's one. Next image, please. Of Alexander shortly before his arrest. And crucially, Piotr gave me a name of the person he thought his father might have stayed with in Warsaw, Dębinski. A few months later, Marta, my researcher, called me. Her voice was quivering with emotion because she said, "Jack, I've found it. I've found Pilecki's report." She's been working in an archive in London where there are just thousands of missives and reports gathered. But using that name, Dębinski, it helped to locate a folder. And in that folder was the story of how Pilecki's message reached Warsaw, was ferried across occupied Europe to reach the Allies in London. So I write about that in the book, but I wanted to share with you tonight the shocking message itself. This is what Pilecki had to say, and I think it captures both his desperation and his clear-sightedness. Next image, please. "We beg the Polish government, for the love of God, to bomb the camp and end our torment. Should we die in the attack, it would be a relief given the circumstances. This is the urgent and well-considered request sent on behalf of my comrades by the witness of their torment." Already in 1940, Pilecki recognized that what was happening in the camp was so terrible, it was worth his life and everyone else in it if it meant destroying the camp. In the book, I describe the report's reception in London and that incredible moment when Pilecki's words reached the highest levels of Allied command. Pilecki didn't just do this once. By my count, he sent at least 10 reports via secret messengers from the camp that charted its evolution to a death factory. Perhaps none was more important than the message Pilecki composed in the summer of 1942 as the first transports bearing Jewish families from all over Europe began arriving in a new camp called Birkenau. Next image, please. Double click. So these images are taken later in the war, but they show the terrible moment when families would arrive, women, children would be separated. The men usually were registered as workers. The women, children, and elderly were typically led away to be gassed. These are images taken at the end of the war. These children were survivors, but I think just seeing them makes you realize how many kids died in Auschwitz. Here is Birkenau, the stables aerial view, where Jewish workers were packed in, 700 into each building. Next image. So Pilecki couldn't go to Birkenau himself. He is in the bottom right-hand corner in the main camp. To the left, you can see the location of Birkenau. What was happening in Birkenau was one of the greatest secrets in Nazi officialdom at the time. They knew that their crime was unprecedented and evil. But of course, the fact that it was one of the greatest secrets of the Nazis didn't put Pilecki off from discovering what it was. He worked out how to put one of his men in Birkenau's makeshift hospital in the camp. And from there, his contact established lines of communication with the Jewish prisoners operating the gas chambers, from which he gleaned details of what was happening. Pilecki struggled to grasp the scale of the crime, or why the Nazis wanted to kill Jewish families, but he knew he had to inform the world at once and was prepared to risk an escape this time to do so. Once again, Pilecki provided the name of the messenger, Stanisław Jasta, and this time he gave a few more details, because this escape that he helped arrange was truly one of the most extraordinary in Auschwitz's history, and perhaps in the history of any wartime camp. 4 prisoners broke into an SS warehouse, stole SS uniforms, walked over to the commandant's garage, took his car, and drove out the gate. It's one of those acts of ingeniousness and creativity that Pilecki displayed all the time in the camp. Jasta didn't survive the war and left no testimony. But it turned out that one of his escapers did, Kazimierz Piechowski. Next image, please. Here is his mugshot. And next image. Here he is when I met him at the age of 96 in Gdansk, still alive, still able to recall that escape in the most remarkable detail. And give me, too, the date when Jasta broke away from the group to deliver his report to Warsaw. That date allowed me to identify a fragment of a report of Jasta's, in the operation, that described the operation of the gas chambers. This is the first news of what was happening in Birkenau to reach Warsaw and then the rest of the world. Next image. Here's one of those reports that reached Warsaw around that time. This was an agonizing moment for Pilecki. By then, he'd built up an underground of almost 1,000 men. He had an uprising plan ready to go. He'd identified a reserve arms supply where he knew they could raid to arm the men, and which bridges to blow up to cripple the arrival of trains in the camp. He'd even begun assassinating SS officers in the camp by planting typhus-bearing lice on SS men's jackets. Pilecki was waiting for a signal, but it never came. He struggled to understand why. He wondered whether he had actually failed to capture what was happening in the camp. The scale of the murder was rapidly escalating. When Jasta, his messenger, had escaped, 35,000 Jews had died in the camp. By the end of 1942, 200,000 were dead. Pilecki was racked with a sense of guilt. He was working in a warehouse at the time where the shoes and luggage of murdered Jews was processed, including the tresses of hair shaved from the corpses of Jewish women. Other prisoners were building the 4 major new crematorium gas chambers that would increase the camp's killing capacity to 6,000 people a day. Next image. Here are some of those prisoners building the crematoria in the early spring of 1943. And next image. And here is an SS plan for one of those crematoria. Amazingly, we have this plan today, this particular one, because it was stolen by Pilecki's men and smuggled out of the camp. Pilecki was racked by guilt. He describes a moment seeing a family assembled beside the main gate, about to be led into the crematorium to be shot, and his eyes catch those of a 10-year-old boy there, 10 years old. It's the same age of his son, Andrei, at the time. He walks away, and he hears the gunshots as they're being executed. And that night, he sees that boy, and he's filled with shame, because for all their talk of uprisings in the camp, he hadn't been able to save the life of a single child. Next image. Here is Pilecki. This was a drawing made of Pilecki by a fellow prisoner around that time, which I think captures the heaviness of his experience. Pilecki finally concluded he needed to escape the camp, to try and rally a force to attack it. Escaping had become even more dangerous, partly because of the breakouts that he had himself arranged. He couldn't, of course, steal the commandant's car this time. He thought about using the camp sewers and found a manhole cover between 2 of the barrack blocks that he managed to sneak into. So he spent much of the spring of 1943 slithering on his belly at night through the dark, through all the prisoners' excrement, trying to find a way out to warn the world. Next image. Naturally, I wanted to take a look. Here's me going down that same sewer hole. Next image. Fortunately, somewhat cleaner than when Pilecki tried. So what Pilecki discovered was that that tunnel actually led straight to Commandant Hearst's house and to his dog kennel, so that wasn't the way to escape. But eventually he hit upon another plan, that he would escape from a bakery during the night shift, which was operated by prisoners, and then embark on a helter-skelter run across 100 miles of Nazi-occupied Poland to a safe house in the hills outside Krakow. So once again, the best way to discover just how Pilecki managed this feat was to follow in his footsteps. Next image, please. Click twice. So the bakery no longer exists, but this was its location, and this we staged the same escape at the same moment and the same hour as he did, here walking along the banks of the Vistula until we came to the point where he crossed at dawn. And this was the field, just as the sun was breaking, that he had to dash across, and the trees that he rested on in the background. Next image. And then he traveled across southern Poland, skirting around Krakow until he reached a safe house in Nowy Wiżnicz. Next image, double click. So here is Pilecki with his two fellow escapers a few days after reaching that safe house. This is his host and daughter. And incredibly, like so many places following Witold's footsteps, that building still exists. Here it is. And that 2-year-old girl you saw a picture of, that's her now making me a cup of tea. And that table bearing the lovely sandwiches is where Pilecki wrote his first report as a free man, describing what was happening in the camp. But for all his feats in the camp, his escape, his desperate struggle against the Germans in Warsaw, his stand against Poland's communists after the war, I find myself coming back to that Warsaw apartment and that first act of courage. Next image. And here's why. Because in that act of volunteering, Pilecki set himself on a trajectory that was different to every other person sent to the camp. Next image. He was there by choice. He chose to go to Auschwitz. He chose to form an underground cell. He chose to smuggle reports out of the camp. Why is that act of choosing important? Because he reminds us that empathizing with the suffering of those beyond our immediate family and friends is also a choice. As the fate of his report shows, it's not the instinctive reaction of many people to seek to come to the rescue of others, especially if they themselves are in danger or facing hardship. But just because it's not our instinctive reaction, it doesn't absolve us from taking action. The Nazis were counting on the world looking the other way. The Italian survivor Primo Levi recounts being told by an SS guard upon arrival in Auschwitz in 1944. Next image. However this war may end, we have won the war against you. None of you will be left to bear witness. But even if some were to survive, the world would not believe him. Pilecki asks us, no matter how gruesome the subject, no matter how difficult our own circumstances, that we never stop trying to understand the plight of others. Next image. This is the last photograph taken as Pilecki as a free man, a few months before his arrest by the communists. He died knowing he had failed to deliver his message. My hope is that this book will finally help us hear him. For the past 3 years, I felt compelled to follow in Pilecki's footsteps. As a reporter, I've always been drawn to extremes, and I found none more so than in Pilecki's story of survival in Auschwitz. It describes the worst that we can do to each other, and surprisingly, some of the best. So I invite you to please join me in that journey, and I'd like to invite up David and to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Do we need these? You guys can hear? Well, first, my God, well done, Jack Fairweather.
Thanks, sir.
Just brilliant. The pleasure and the task of reading your book in recent days, and I've got to say it was surprising and moving and fascinating. I got to know Jack years ago when you were a war correspondent, as you mentioned, covering Iraq and Afghanistan, and that was very much about how our societies were functioning and implicated in what was happening and at times unraveling, of course, in the countries of Iraq and Afghanistan. You talked about discovering this story and talking to Matt McAllister, also a distinguished war correspondent and a good friend of yours. What impelled you to take the leap and say, I'm not just going to write about what led to what I had to cover on the front lines, but I'm going to write about this instance which in miniature tells us so much about something that took place on this continent so many decades ago.
That's a great question. Well, I saw Pilecki as a reporter on some level. He wasn't one by training or background, but he was compelled to by what he witnessed in the camp. And I think understanding how he could tackle such a vast set of crimes that dwarfed anything that Matt or I had witnessed was intriguing. Of course, then there's just that deep injustice that his reports were not listened to. That was something else that Matt and I could identify with, having tried to raise awareness about
all the reports from the journalists and presumably even reports from military officials saying, guys, this isn't working the way you're telling the public.
Exactly. We struggle to have the voices of those we interviewed, some desperate voices in Iraq and Afghanistan, heard. So I felt that connection with Pilecki, but I think once I started following in his footsteps, you realize that what he was dealing with was just on a different scale to anything in the Middle East.
So much that's occurred in this time, in this era, obviously has such, it foreshadows such devastation, and the forces seem so large as to seem overwhelming to think about, much less to have endured or fought against. And yet there's these stories, you realize that these things happen in miniature, in immediate moments in people's individual lives, as well as the great forces there. Part of the risk that he took was not only organizing and resisting, and you tell it, it's very, if there are no agents in the crowd here for Hollywood, it's a real mistake. They're squandering their time tonight somewhere else. But it seems to me that there are moments where not only has he taken great bravery in his acts resisting the Nazis before entering the camp, but even in recording information. Give folks just a little anecdote, just a little soupçon of things that he did to acquire information that took bravery and ingenuity on his part once he was in the camps.
That's a great question. So
they're all only going to be great questions tonight, I want to assure you of that.
So, at a certain point, Pilecki realized that he needed documentary evidence of Nazi crimes, that his first reports sent out of the camp were oral messages that he gave to his messengers. But because there wasn't a response, he realized they needed more. And so he planted a man who worked as a prisoner clerk in the SS office where they recorded all prisoner deaths. And at night, that man secretly started copying down those records which were finally smuggled out of the camp.
Presumably risking instantaneous death. You could be dead for looking at a guard the wrong way, much less recording the deepest secrets of this evil place.
Exactly. And incredibly, reports that turned out to be entirely accurate. These were reports that the British were listening to via the Enigma intercepts. They had cracked the SS camp's codes, and so they were picking up some of these figures. And so there's this sort of agonizing moment where Pilecki's sort of smuggling out these messages. The British are hearing these numbers and yet somehow they do nothing.
So let's drill down on that for a moment, because it's you know that it's true. Like, I go into the book knowing that it's true, that the Americans, FDR, that Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, these great figures of the Allies, essentially are like, yeah, we're not really that eager to bomb the camps, as he so eloquently urged, as early as October 1940, if I'm not mistaken. So, years before things got to be their worst at the camp, right? They didn't want to go there in 40, they didn't want to go there in 41, they didn't want to go there really till I think it's 44 they started thinking seriously about it. What was the resistance predicated on? What didn't they believe about what Sikorsky and these incredibly brave people inside Auschwitz were telling them?
Well, I think there was a struggle to believe that for me is very eloquently put by the experience of Jan Karski when he spoke to the US Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter in 1943. He recounted to him his personal experience of witnessing the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and the way station to Belzec, and Frankfurter said, to paraphrase, "I hear what you're saying, Mr. Karski, but I don't believe you." That is, he could understand the basic details, but he couldn't grasp what he was hearing. It was a failure on some level of the imagination, and I think that was a challenge. It was a challenge that Pilecki faced in the camp. I mean, he also had to struggle to
apprehend what was in front of him.
It was unprecedented, these crimes, and he couldn't always discern what the Nazis were up to. And I think that struggle is one that was reflected at each point along the route of his. Everyone who read his messages, in short, had that struggle, but obviously what made Pilecki different was he just kept at it until he did understand, and that tenacity, that sort of absolute desire to get at the truth was what distinguished him from so many others.
One of the things that struck me, and one of the things that I thought was one of the great insights of the book, of which there are many, was the way in which he sort of comes to an understanding of what's happening, but also of the fact that it's changing. That is, his apprehension and his understanding evolves over time, and what's actually occurring there is evolving over time at the same. So it's almost as though there's, it's a time-space relativity gap where his mind keeps having to adapt to understand the further horrors that the Germans are diving into, often with the willingness of many Poles. And that's what he's also trying to capture and convey, and that's a very complicated thing politically. Why is it so hard for the Poles to unify around this and say, this is going to be what the Allies are going to come to Poland for with full force, and we can wrap around this is the substantive message we're conveying? Because even the Polish government in exile was not perfectly sanguine about passing along that message.
Right. Well, the truth was there was so many reports reaching Warsaw and the underground leadership, as well as Pilecki's. He was just a single source. There was reports of the Einsatzgruppen's mass murder in occupied Russia. There were stories of gas chambers elsewhere in the country. There was a lot of misinformation, stories about how people were being killed and their bodies used to make soap for German families, mass electrocution of prisoners. It was very hard for people to sift through that sort of mountain of evidence. So I have some sort of sympathy both for the underground and indeed for the likes of Churchill. There was a lot of misinformation,
As a former foreign editor, you're like, I need more documentation. I need more.
Right. Well, actually, that's what incredibly the underground leadership did. They sent a guy to Auschwitz, and for me, it's one of those amazing moments in the camp where you have a courier who's bound for London come outside Auschwitz, establish contact with Pilecki's group inside, tells them, I'm here, I'm going to London, send me your information, and they smuggle out a report to him, including what we think is a letter by Pilecki. He obviously didn't sign it, but we had a forensic philologist usually works on crime with the police to identify anonymous letters, go over this letter and to try and identify it as Pilecki's. Anyway, this was the
CSI Poland. It's
CSI Auschwitz.
Yes, right.
Yeah, and then that then reached London, and and then we're back to the story of why it wasn't responded to.
So in a few minutes, we'll open the floor open. I will sort of take some of the questions and feed them to Jack and see if we can wring some truth out of the man. But what happens to him leading up is very interesting as well. There are two things that struck me. One of which is that. And they are related, I think, if I remember it right. But one of which is that there are tensions within the Polish underground. There are all these different groups springing up in the resistance before he enters the camps. And Pilecki essentially sees himself as a Polish nationalist, sees himself as a patriot, had, I think, served in the army, and was proud of that, but realized that a lot of folks who had that same, shall we say, demographic sort of were trying to achieve unity through an ultra-nationalism that echoed the Germans in some ways in their anti-Semitism, and that there was this tension within the resistance group, and indeed something of a power struggle with him, between him and another leader over that very question. I thought that was very interesting that it was that explicit before he enters the camps, that he realizes some of the guys on my side are not, it's not that they have different ideology, it's that their morality is just eons apart.
Right.
And he couldn't quite reconcile himself with that.
Right, well, Pilecki writes very little about politics, in fact, except to say that he doesn't like it. But one of the few truly political gestures he made was to take a stand against his commander of the cell he belonged to, who wanted to take the organization in this ultra-nationalistic direction. And Pilecki was like, no, this is the wrong way. We can't go down the route of an ethno-nationalistic Catholic background. We've got to open ourselves up to everyone who wants to fight the Nazis. That's the only way to defeat them. And I think it shows that clear-sightedness that he often exhibited, to recognize that what the Nazis were trying to do to Poland was to break it down into its component parts, to sort of render groups apart, to divide people racially, but even break people down personally. And Pilecki recognized that to be an effective resistance, they needed to come together. His commander wasn't very pleased about this principled stand, and suggested to the overall commander, a mission for Pilecki.
Right, so this is also interesting. I want to interrupt there, because this book is called The Volunteer, and you learn that he was not precisely a volunteer. He was, in a sense, volunteered for this mission. When they unify with another group, he says, I know that we want to send somebody underground to try to get information from Auschwitz, and I've got just the man for you.
Right.
This guy who was a pain in my neck, let's send him, right?
Right, exactly.
And he has to decide if he's going to do it. What made Pilecki say, all right, this guy who I had this this political struggle with, and who I'm very troubled by, has volunteered me for clearly not a death-defying mission, but a suicide mission of sorts, and I'm going to do it.
Right.
Why does he rise and say yes?
That's a great question, David.
Sure, as promised.
For sure, he felt a sense of duty, and I think his patriotism and his faith that sustained him in the camp and helped guide him in his life. But I actually came in to realize that there was another element to why he volunteered for the camp. He realized that the secret of the resistance was a force that could sustain people. That when he'd done a lot of recruiting in Warsaw, when he took a young man aside and told him his secret, he was placing his life in that man's hands. And that was a true act of faith, an act of trust that formed the bonds of the resistance. And I think Pilecki realized, I don't know because we can only go on his actions and the little he wrote, but from what he did in the camp, how he recruited, what he told recruits, was that this act of trust was what would bond them together against the Nazis. And I think he realized that he was the man with able to do that. His commander, not so much. He had that vision of bringing people together.
And before we bring people in, one last question I wanted to ask you was about Pilecki's story is not known in the West. It was not known really, I think, in Poland for many decades, and it was suppressed by the Soviets and the Polish regime they supported, who had executed him a few short years after the war itself. During that regime there. And it seems to me that in reading your book and in reading a bit about him subsequently, he's become something, or he had become something of a political, this man, and antithetical to politics, a hero by almost any definition. I can't imagine one where he's not. Had become something of a political football. That is, for many years, the Soviets and the Polish regime under the Eastern Bloc didn't want to talk about him as a hero because he rose up against them. And then there are those who would, it would seem to me, sort of exploit his name in Poland on behalf of a nationalism that would have curdled him, in a sense, because of his principled stand in favor of Polish Jews. After all, I think 90-some% of Jews perished during the war. just a small, percentage remained after the war. What do you make of his, not just the legacy you've sketched out, but of the use of his legacy in those decades and the attempt to expunge it, I guess, immediately after his death?
I mean, I remember at the beginning of my research reading about the resurgence of a group called ONR in Poland. This was a group that had existed in 1930s Poland and was known for its proto-fascism and its sympathy for Nazi causes, and indeed had been utterly discredited for decades afterwards. It turns out that they are a small minority, but they have reconstituted themselves and taken Pilecki as one of the figures to represent them. And I found it bizarre in many ways that this group could find any traction in Poland, given that its precursor had some of its members actively sought collaboration with the Nazis. But there we are. It was discomforting, and I had some Polish friends who said, Pilecki's this figure that's, representative of
whatever he did during his life, he's a symbol of something else now.
He's become a symbol of something else now, and, are you sure you want to touch that topic?
Mm-hmm. And what reaction have you gotten to that since?
I felt strongly, like you said, that Pilecki's story is not the preserve of any single group, least of all the far right, or his message is one of bringing people together in the face of extreme evil and of bravery and courage, and that I came to believe that my job was in some ways to not just rescue Pilecki's name from historical oblivion in which the communists had cast him, but also to present him to the world and sort of free him from the shackles of any single group in Poland or anywhere else, because I think his message is one that resonates and can bring us together.
One thing I want to say before we turn open was there's this one passage towards the end that really struck me, where he's writing, and he's no longer writing reports. He's writing for himself after he's been freed, and he's living in Soviet-occupied Poland. But he is trying to come to terms with what he's witnessed. I'm sure you know the passage I'm talking about. Jack writes, what emerges from these passages is a sense that Witold's orientation had shifted. No longer did he need his readers to understand that an evil that defied comprehension. Instead, he asked them to look within themselves for that which they could share with those who suffer. I have listened to so many confessions of my friends before their deaths, he wrote around then. They all reacted in the same unexpected manner. They regretted they hadn't given enough to other people of their hearts, of the truth. The only thing that remained after them on earth, the only thing that was positive and had a lasting value, was what they could give of themselves to others. With that, I would love to give you guys the chance, if we could dim the lights a little bit so I can see these fine folks. And I'll try to direct traffic a little bit here. Questions for Jack Fairweather, the author of Volunteer. Yes, ma'am, let's start in the back there. Please just say your first name if you don't mind, and then ask your question.
My name is Krystyna Piórkowska, and I think it's regrettable that in the entire discussion this evening, there was no point made about the Devil's Alliance, which for 22 months supplied Hitler with petroleum and grain from the Soviet Union, which allowed him to work and bring forward his plans. I think it's regrettable that the term Poland was used instead of Auschwitz being part of the Reich and the general government. There was not a Vichy France in Poland, and I find those terms to be particularly slanted and biased. To say Poland, he was escaping to Poland, to Krakow. There was not a free Poland. I think your terms in discussing Churchill or Franklin Delano Roosevelt and how they dealt with the reports is particularly generous towards those gentlemen, because they did make a bargain with the devil. Their willingness to have the Soviet Union use the bodies of, and trust me, I have no great affection for Belarusian or Ukrainians who were sent in front of Tukhachevsky's troops without weapons to be cannon fodder, was a bargain that FDR made. And that's why when in April of '43, the English-speaking witnesses to Katyn got reports through coded letters and through radio messages about what had happened in Katyn, neither Franklin Roosevelt's government or Churchill's government wanted to deal with that issue because it was much better to have an alliance with the Soviets.
So I'd like to talk about your points. Let's sharpen your question if you don't mind, though. I'd like her to ask a question if she has it, but I do want to, I think your points I'd love to discuss them with Jack, but if you don't mind coming to a question mark, I'll have him address them.
My question was, why are you so forgiving of FDR and Churchill?
And thank you for your question. I appreciate it. Let me bring this up with Jack now. So we talk, I think it's an important context. Of course, I assume it's of no surprise to anybody who's attending tonight, but nonetheless, important context of, that Stalin and Hitler forged a great non-aggression pact, and then the U.S. and Britain decided they could not win the war without Stalin, and they did strike a deal with him. How did that affect the fate of Poland? How did that affect people like the one you're writing about?
It was utterly cataclysmic for Poland, and thank you for your passion on the subject. I address it at length in the book. I don't think Churchill and Roosevelt emerge from my telling as in any gentle or soft-pedaled way, not least because of the way in which they turned their backs on the Polish underground towards the end of the war, that ultimately cost Pilecki his life. I think it's a very difficult and in some ways shameful chapter of Allied history, the treatment of Poland at the end of the war. And as much as it relates to Pilecki's story, I try and tell it as honestly and objectively as possible. So thank you for your comments. I think you will find them addressed in the book. Yes, at the back. Sorry.
That's right. Go ahead. Insulate you.
Unfortunately, I didn't read your book, and
I'm sorry. Say your name again, sir.
My name is Stefan.
Welcome.
I intend to read your book. It sounds like it's a great book. But I wanted to know what your thoughts would be in regards to Polish-Jewish relations. Did the fact that this story was kept from the public view worsen, perhaps, or allow Jewish-Polish relations not to improve? Was there do you think that the fact that this wasn't told before had a negative effect on Polish-Jewish relations? And now that it's coming out, do you think it will improve Polish-Jewish relations? And unfortunately, I wanted to add the irony of the fact that this man who perhaps was one of the first to alert the world about the Holocaust by the Germans, the irony of the fact that one of his main torturers when he was on communist custody happened to be a Jewish communist. So how does that also affect, because on the one hand it should be a positive, but then on the other hand there's that one aspect which could also be used negatively and then kind of ruin the whole thing. Meanwhile, it's really just individuals doing things in the name of ideology, not necessarily their ethnicity.
So the question a bit about whether or not, had the story come to light, or the story coming to light, would that have done more to perhaps unify Poles and Polish Jews, presumably? What do you make of that notion?
I feel that Pilecki's story helps us see the connection between what is the Polish perspective of the camp, which was a place of suffering for predominantly Catholic but Polish political prisoners, and Jewish perspective, which is of the camp as the center of the Holocaust. And Pilecki's story does bring those two perspectives together, because he was a witness to both and sought to report on both and responded in much the same way to the horrors. So I would hope that this book would help people bridge that gap.
Like the earlier question, it seemed to me from reading the book, and it turns out I'm not the author, but it seems to me from reading it that a complicated and painful picture emerges from almost all the players involved. There's compromise there. There's a character who is, in a sense, part of the camp resistance, who himself was accused of war crimes. Dering, I believe his name was, who was a physician at the camp hospital who saved people, got information out, really helped him in a lot of ways, and also injected some of the inmates with deadly materials, and sort of enabled the Nazis to perform certain kinds of experiments on people. That's somebody who committed horrors and is yet a complicated person because he enabled resistance to survive. I mean, they had to make, I'm not saying you can justify what he did at all, but I can understand that this was the sort of person Witold had to work with at times, which is a really complicated thing as well. Do we have questions on this? If we could get a microphone down here, please.
Thank you. Jack, my name is Lydia. I have two questions. One, in your very early slide, you're showing that he sends a message in 1940 to the Polish government, to Warsaw. So I was wondering when he's asking, please send the planes with bombs and let's bomb Auschwitz, did Poland even had at that time planes that had bombs that could bomb Auschwitz? Did you find this out?
So fascinating. There's a fact in there that Jack brings to light that is amazing about
so
that.
So that's one question, which I found that I just would like to have you answer. And the second question would be, why was he killed?
Okay, well,
tell them about the Polish planes, which surprised me. I didn't really remember that.
Right, well, I mean, famously, a squadron fought during the Battle of Britain, a Polish squadron, Polish airmen, that played a seminal role in protecting Britain. In fact, they had the highest kill rate among any RAF squadron. So their story was publicized, and one of the Pilecki, one of the things that he managed to do was steal a radio to listen to BBC reports whilst in the camp. So I think he had some sense of what was going on. The bigger question is, was it actually possible to bomb the camp in 1940, at the time when the Brits were struggling with the Blitz and had a very small bomber command? And I talk about it in the book because it's one of those great might-have-beens, but technically it was possible to get a Wellington bomber with a payload of explosives to Auschwitz. Technically. There are a lot of issues. I mean, it's amazing to think about, but those planes didn't have radar then. I mean, early in the war, they flew by sight. So they needed clear nights when they were going to do bombing raids over Germany, which is just crazy to hear. And if the clouds blew in, they did this. They just guessed by how many hours they thought it would take them to get to their site and just drop the bombs where they were. So there were a lot of technical issues. But of course, the crucial issue was maybe they might not have destroyed Auschwitz then, but what they would have done was tried. And trying to bomb the camp on humanitarian grounds in 1940 would truly have been a game changer, because every time one of Pilecki's next messages came, they would have already established the precedent of trying, and that's really the missed opportunity.
It's interesting because it's obviously abhorrent and terrible to think that they didn't do that. Reading it in the moment, your book, sadly, I kind of came to the conclusion, I understand why they decided not to. It would have been, it's not just, it would have been incredibly long shot, very hard to get anywhere near. There was one anecdote you have of fighters trying to do this, pilots trying, or bombers trying to do the same thing. I think going up to near Scotland and blowing up some of their own base or something, that it's just very hard to do. And yet, had they done it and failed, as the technologies improved over the course of the war, suddenly it become much more feasible, and they'd already be on these runs, and this would be an expected practice and thing they were attempting, and how important that would have been to try and to do, even if to fail right away. There was another thing in your book where you talk about one of the first reports that got the attention of American Jewish groups and international Jewish groups that was gotten out by a Jewish, essentially agent, and smuggled out similarly, and that finally forced certain kinds of coverage, if I'm not mistaken, in the Times and in London and elsewhere. So he was not the only person attempting to do this.
So that was the two Jewish prisoners escaped in 44, Verber and Wetzler, and their report finally got the attention of Allied commanders in a way that none of Pilecki's had. And it is actually one of those sort of agonizing moments, because as Churchill and various Allied commanders are considering what to do about Auschwitz, one of the suggestions that comes up is let's contact the Polish underground to attack the camp. At that very moment, Pilecki he's been trying for months after escaping the camp to rally a force to attack it, and he's just about given up as the Warsaw uprising approaches. But it's, there's this conversation in Washington, there's Pilecki on the ground in Warsaw, and they're
taking it seriously because they can't suppress coverage of it. In London, a lot of his reports, which Sikorsky was trying to get some attention to, were, the old hands at the propaganda arm of the state, of the, I guess it must have been the Ministry of War, or whatever it was in London, was saying, I wouldn't give that a lot of circulation. It's a little hysterical. It's a little out there. You don't need to be covering that. And the papers basically didn't cover it with any seriousness.
Right.
And this was something that was outside the government's control, where suddenly, as in so many circumstances, they had to come back to it. We have time for 2 or 3 more questions, I think. I'm sorry, there was a second question. I apologize. We're not going to do 2 questions for everyone, but if you...
That was why Pilecki was...
The question was, why was he killed?
Why was he killed?
So Pilecki, after the Warsaw Uprising, was interned again by the Germans and ended up at the very end of the war in a German camp and traveled to Italy. Soviet forces occupied Poland, and he conceived of going back to the country, setting up a new cell to begin reporting, this time on Soviet crimes against Poles. And so that's what he did. He scribbled off yet another report about Auschwitz. That was the one I showed you the slide of. That was one of his longest ones, in which he wrote again about what the camp was for prosperity, and then headed back to Poland. And he was betrayed, and a sort of a year or so later, and then executed as an enemy of the communist Polish state.
Question here in the center, this right here. The microphone is working its way towards the center, I think.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation tonight.
Your name?
Wendy Schreiber, if you're interested in the last name, but it's Wendy. I'm curious about the Catholic Church, what their role was during this time. We're all very aware of the anti-Semitism that was endemic in Poland at that time. In the research that you did you find that the Catholic Church took any positive role in trying to help the situation? Were they a positive or a negative?
That's a great question, and it's one that historians haven't fully been able to answer, because the Vatican is still sitting on many of its wartime records.
Which doesn't give enormous confidence.
No.
To the answer,
although
sadly.
Pope Francis has, said that he will release, will open them up in due course. So until they do, it's hard to sort of reach a full assessment. But what's clear is that in the autumn of
May 5th, 2020.
there you go.
That's your next book. It'll be the follow-up for next year.
What's clear is that when news did start to reach the US in the late summer, early autumn of 42, the US State Department sent a delegation to the Pope. The State Department in some ways wanted to have the church sort of take the moral lead in condemning Nazi crimes rather than take on that responsibility itself. But they went to the Pope and said, "What have you heard about the mass murder of Jews in Europe?" And it somewhat beggars belief, his response, which was that he hadn't heard, he couldn't confirm any reports. And it's, you know, I think for me that says all you need to know, because for sure somewhere across all those bishoprics in Poland, Germany, France, word had been passed back to the Vatican. So we'll wait to 2020 to discover exactly what that was.
Jack, do you have a feel for, in your research, for in Poland itself at the outbreak of war, and as it was clear the Germans would be occupying, which they did just, you know, really like a blitzkrieg as they called it, the degree to which society exceeded and embraced, the degree to which society resigned itself, the degree to society resisted?
Yeah, so I think on this question of anti-Semitism, which is to some extent
closely related, sure.
Related. I mean, there was strong strains of Polish anti-Semitism before the war. It was very different to that which the Nazis brought to Poland. The sort of anti-Semitism in Poland before the war was terrible and repugnant, but it was rooted in this sort of sense of economic competition, and the Nazis' vision of Jews was on a whole different scale. And I think it's important because when we say anti-Semitism, you know, there is this important distinction to be drawn. Polish anti-Semitism was different to the German ones. Now, once the Germans took up power in occupied Poland, they instituted this, I mean, the most racist regime on earth that there's ever been, and they created all sorts of incentives for Poles to betray Jews who were in hiding, to betray other Poles who were hiding Jews. I mean, they sought to indoctrinate Poles into their way of thinking, and some did. There were Polish blackmail gangs running around making money at the behest of the Germans, but there were also a lot of families that, despite this regime, sheltered Jewish families. And there's a great book called Secret City by a historian that really shows how much of the population of Warsaw was actually helping Jewish families. And of course the memories of survivors is not of the many families that helped them, it's of the blackmailers or the family that betrayed them naturally, or betrayed, you know, led to deaths, and so that sort of rises to the surface. But I think there is a sort of, there is a story of cooperation that I touch upon in the book. I also don't want to sugarcoat this world. As you pointed out, the experience of Daring, a man who Pilecki first turned to in the camp as a collaborator who, with the underground, who then ended up as a Nazi collaborator. I mean, this is a complex story. The forces that were at play on people, I think, you know, are almost beyond our comprehension. They would break many of us, I think, and for those like Pilecki who managed to stand up, it's, you know, I think there's something for us all to learn there.
One last question, if I might. This gentleman's been waiting patiently here.
Thank you very much for your fascinating story. My name is Tzvi, and my question is, did Pilecki receive a number? And if not, how did he manage to escape the Zellapels of the Germans, who were notoriously, I mean, standing in the morning and several times a day and counting and keeping the records management of
You're
each
asking
and
if
every...
he, I'm so sorry, sir, you're asking if he had a number tattooed on him?
Yes,
Yes.
yes. And if not, how did he manage to escape it?
The introduction of tattoos on prisoners was something that came a year or so into the camp with the arrival of Soviet POWs. So some of the early prisoners escaped being tattooed, and so Pilecki didn't have a tattoo. Of course, later prisoners were all tattooed.
So if not, how did he escape all this counting and the records and?
The prisoners at roll call every morning had to read out their numbers, and they ticked them off. So they didn't. The Nazis, the SS authorities didn't check prisoner tattoos when they were doing roll calls. You stood in line, you read out your number, you got ticked, and that's how they worked out how many were in the camp. Of course, that helps explain why roll call was such a horrific experience for so many prisoners, because there were so many miscounts, and it could last hours, and the most, midwinter, it was often a terrible experience.
So we've heard this evening a story of extraordinary bravery, heroism, and a principled stance in the face of, what we know to be, the greatest evil one could comprehend, or beyond one's comprehension. It was interesting to me, he was also a person with a family, a wife, 2 small children that he really observed in some ways from afar, even after he escaped, perhaps especially after he escaped. And his wife clearly resented in some ways some of the things he did. At the end, when she's explaining what he's done after he's agreed to serve in the underground against the Soviet-backed regime, his wife Maria explains that she and the children saw him as a hero. Like, even in the moment, even as they didn't get out, even as he took up arms again, even as he knew he would ultimately have to be crushed, even as he's going to a show trial where he was one of the first Poles put on trial in a public way to basically teach a lesson to the rest of the Poles not to resist. And he says, I'm just ready for it to be over. They saw him as a hero in the moment. It's an extraordinary tale, very moving. And I just want to thank Jack Fairweather for sharing it with us, and you all to come out and join us today.
Thank you very much.
Of course, I'd like to thank the Council of Poland and the folks here at the museum as well for staging this event. A wonderful evening, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.